Well, the US has completed what it called heavy strikes on Iran in retaliation for firing on US bases in Jordan and at ships in the Strait of Hormuz. So after a lull last weekend that did arouse some hope of another ceasefire, both sides are back in action. Iran, through its militia allies, has really stepped up its attacks on the energy sector this week, hitting Saudi Arabian tankers and terminals. And yesterday, an attack on a US-owned tanker in Egypt suggests a wider strategy to shut off one by one Saudi Arabia's routes for exporting its energy. Meanwhile, the Saudis and Americans yesterday bombed pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. So in just a few days, the conflict has spread across the region, sparking fresh fears of an energy price spiral. Well, to explore this subject with us, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Carole Nakhle, CEO of Crystol Energy and former parliamentary advisor on energy and Middle Eastern issues in the House of Lords. Dr. Nakhle, welcome to Times Radio.
Hello.
Let's start off with what's been going on recently, which is, I guess, the Houthi card, the Yemenis, who side with Iran, has been played. They've been interrupting shipping through that connection between the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf, the Bab el-Mandab, and now they also seem to be attacking the northern route out of the Red Sea, Egypt, the Iranian-backed groups, that is. What's happening in the markets? Because this must be quite shocking, surely.
It is definitely an escalation of the conflict. And as you can read across various media outlets, headlines, they are describing it as spreading, that the conflict between the US and Iran is spreading across the region, across the whole Middle East. It's not anymore limited to the Strait of Hormuz and stopping ships leaving that area. Now, definitely, when you look at the Red Sea, there are two exits in the south across the Bab el-Mandab. And this is how you would take some of the Saudi oil, for instance, which was diverted from the western side, from the eastern side to the western side, away from Hormuz, would exit to get to the Asian customers. But there's also the northern side, which is the Suez Canal. So that kind of route, north and south, kind of provided some relief, a relief valve to global energy markets, among others. And so far, those two exit points have been attacked in the south by the Houthis, and the north, today what happened in the Suez Canal is quite alarming. However, the market is concerned, but not panicking, because these are quite isolated events created by the proxies of Iran, who don't have the same power as the Iranian regime itself. And that's why we see, yes, energy prices increasing, oil prices in particular, but we don't see really this kind of sustained increase and staying there for a long period. We see this kind of yo-yo movement in oil prices at the moment because it's concern, not panic.
Do you think that the fact that the impact on prices has still been relatively modest is due to a sort of assumption by people in the trade, in the energy business, that the two sides do still fundamentally want to try and get back to some sort of ceasefire?
Absolutely. When I think about the situation, there are two factors I take into consideration. First, what you described, and this is why we don't have panic in the market. I mean, the two parties are still pursuing diplomatic route. They have not abandoned it entirely. Both the American side and the Iranian side, they say they still prefer to use the diplomatic route. However, during any kind of negotiations, you would expect either party to kind of show that they are in control and they can cause much bigger disruption if their demands are not met. And that's why we're having this kind of targeted attacks. I think the moment we see those negotiations completely abandoned and there is no more hope for any diplomatic route to be used, then we start taking it a little bit more seriously and start really worrying about the impact on global energy prices. But there is another dimension that we are not often talking about, is that despite the scale of the conflict and the disruption to energy markets, the economy is sending us a clear message. We are much more resilient to shocks in the Middle East than we used to be, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. And that is a fact. It does not degrade or downplay the situation in the Middle East, but telling us that we have built more resilience than we had in the past.
Well, I mean, I guess that's a sort of hopeful note if people are fearful about energy prices this winter. Can you tell us how that's been done, the building in of that greater resilience? Where is the supply coming from, or is it a case of switching to more renewables? What's created that, in your view?
It is never one single silver answer. So throughout the years, we have diversified our energy needs. So we have diversified not only in terms of alternatives to oil and gas, because oil and gas still represent an important share of our global energy mix. But to give you a number, in 1970s, when the first oil shock happened, oil used to meet more than half of our global energy needs. Today, that share decreased to 30%. So just gives us an idea that oil is not as important as it used to be, for example, several decades ago. But it's not just the supplies of energy or the source of energy, it's where we are getting our energy from. The US is today the biggest producer of oil, not Saudi Arabia. So that's another dimension. There have been lots of suppliers coming to the picture over the last few years and decades, and that by itself is helping us. And also consumers changing their pattern of consumption. We see, for example, in the transport sector, we see much more, I live in London, I see much more electric vehicles than, let's say, conventional cars. So all these changes together are creating the kind of resilience that I talked about.
Yes, among the factors I've read about Venezuela pumping more oil.
Definitely. I mean, you have Venezuela, which is sitting on the biggest proven oil reserves in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia. And for years and decades, they have underinvested in their oil sector. So imagine if American companies really deliver on their investment promises in that country, that by itself can flood the market. You have the United Arab Emirates even leaving OPEC a few months ago, and they want to produce as much as they want. So if you ask me in the longer term, beyond the current conflict, I see actually much more supplies than we need. But at the moment, it's very difficult to get that message across because of the situation in the Middle East.
Last question. You've used the word resilience a few times, and I was talking to someone in Saudi Arabia a couple of days ago, and they were also using that word and talking about what it meant. And I guess what we've seen since this started in February is a sort of phase one of the Saudis and the Emiratis trying to use existing pipelines to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. And now, in the last 10 days, we see the Houthis shutting down one of those routes. But will we now see a great wave of construction? You hear people talking about pipelines to the Mediterranean, about railways, about all sorts of things.
Whenever there's a crisis, you will hear a lot of new projects being discussed and lots of new ambitious ideas. But really, the real test would be, does it make sense? And it's not just the Saudis and the Emiratis. The Iraqis, for example, are in discussions with the Turks, with the Syrians, and at some point even with the Lebanese to try to get some of their oil away from Hormuz into the Mediterranean directly. Now, will all these projects materialize? It all depends on how much it's going to cost and who is going to fund them. But definitely across the Middle East and elsewhere, what I'm seeing is infrastructure resilience, because that's what I want to bring in terms of this concept of resilience, our infrastructure, how immune it is. So in the Middle East, ironically, even though you have the biggest producers in the world of oil and gas, there is very little interconnection between each country and its neighbor. So probably one of perhaps the main benefit, if there is an upside of any crisis, would be a better relationship and cooperation between the countries in the region to improve what we are talking about as the resilience of the region and of global energy markets.
Carole Nakhle, thank you so much indeed for explaining all those factors at play in the Gulf energy sector for us.